stone axes, the simplest hoes, spears, and slings. For a long time it was believed that these items, originally intended for hunting and farming, were used by our distant ancestors in their first wars. But is this really the case? The latest discovery by ethnographers, historians, and archaeologists shows that the most terrible and high-tech wars of mankind are in the past. I am interested in questions concerning how nuclear weapons were at the disposal of ancient people. And why did they wage wars with each other? A terrible, destructive wars of the distant past, whose result was the destruction of entire civilizations, came to modern humanity in the form of myths and legends. But they reproduce technologies with amazing accuracy, which scientists of this century are just preparing to approach. These technologies also exist at the moment, when a certain weapon, it is also the interaction with the prints of its owner that works directly. If it ends up in someone else's hands and tries to be used, then the weapon simply becomes unusable. These technologies exist now, and, quite possibly, in some way they were then. Where did the ancient people get weapons of incredible power? Was it the gifts of the gods, as the legends say, or the result of the developments of scientists, to the level of which modern humanity has not yet grown up? Why thousands of years ago, people could move freely in the universe, and today we are preparing a one-way expedition to Mars? And where did the high-tech civilizations that possessed weapons capable of destroying entire worlds go? At the end of the 2013 year, a team of archaeologists from the University of Florida published the results of a sensational study. It turns out that thousands of years ago, our planet went through a period of nuclear wars. This discovery completely reverses the idea of the ancient history of mankind. After all, the most modern method of research of the age of archaeological finds, radioisotope method. With this factor in mind, it becomes ineffective. The use of this method in the study of the Earth and objects exposed to radioactive exposure gives a false picture. An irradiated object that has lain in the ground for 50 years will be determined as an artifact, whose age dates back hundreds of millennia. In my books, I also pay attention to the terrible ancient warriors. Ancient Indian epics, such as the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and the Dranaparva, which is part of the Mahabharata, speak of wars of colossal scale that took place in the past. Reading these epics is like reading exciting science fiction. Large-scale military operations that have come down to us in the form of myths and epics really took place many millennia ago. Legends, both oral and written, quite accurately describe ancient civilizations that possessed superfast transport and weapons thousands of times superior to the modern nuclear arsenal. And the people themselves have reached a new level of spiritual growth and have developed incredible abilities. I am sure that the events that are described in the Puranic works, in the Texans, such as the Mahabharata Ramayana, and other works of that era are all reality. Just a modern person, he is a little, not that, he is very much limited. He is limited in knowledge, limited in spiritual experience, limited by vices, and thanks to, or rather because of these flaws, because of these shortcomings, ignorance, vices, and so on, he cannot see the breadth, the vast range, the bright, stormy life that has been on our planet for many, many millennia ago, when people, from the point of view of culture, from the point of view of their attitude to nature, were much more pure and transparent to each other than they are now.
Когда люди с точки зрения культуры, с точки зрения отношения к природе, друг к другу были куда более чистые и прозрачные, нежели сейчас.
But where did ancient mankind get such an incredible arsenal and fantastic opportunities? Researchers do not have an unambiguous answer to this question. However, fragmentary chronicles that have come down to us in the form of epics and legends make scientists assume that ancient people received power from the hands of the inhabitants of the sky. This is a quote from an article published in the Indian magazine Sarklight, dated September 21st, 1952 year. Describing the flight of the car, the author of the note reported that a craftsman named Tal Bullet built it, guided by the instructions of the ancient Indian manuscripts of the Vimanika Shastra. His wife, a connoisseur of ancient Sanskrit literature, helped him. Quote, 1895th year. A lively square in the town of Chopati near Bombay. Every single local resident gathered. Here, according to rumors, some incredible event is going to happen. At 10 in the morning, Babuji Talpul, a teacher of the Bombay School of Art, appeared in the center of the square. Taking his time, he walked up to the huge structure and pulled off the blanket from it. A wooden bird-like car with triangular wings standing on 3 small wheels appeared before the gasping audience. There was a hole on top of it. The teacher opened the side hatch in the fuselage of the car and began to do something inside. After a while, smoke poured out from under the bird. There was a growing rumble. There were startled exclamations from the crowd. The testers got inside through the hatch, closed it. Firm there it began to tear. Some kind of noise arose very powerful. It feels like it was a turbine of some kind or something, yeah. And then, suddenly, this Viman started moving, developed a colossal speed, took off over the sea, did what? Performed aerobatics. And as if he even landed, and he was on the chassis. Excited spectators ran after the miracle machine that took off. Having risen to a height of at least 500 meters, the Iron Bird made a big circle and began to descend, landing. This story would not have attracted the attention of researchers, and if the designer had not mentioned in the formulas of alloys for aviation, which he used during the creation of his aircraft. His wife read them in the ancient text of the Vimanika Shastra. There were many attempts to explain the technology, but there were many incomprehensible aspects. Obviously, it was a jet engine after all. There has been a lot of speculation about the type of this jet engine. Perhaps mercury or plasma. Professor Adele from the University of Bremen told me that mercury would be the most unsuitable substance in this case, because it does not generate energy under the influence of air. But perhaps these are just translators' mistakes, because the texts have been rewritten many times over the millennia. But what are scientists talking about? Are the legends and myths of the ancient Vedic civilization really true? Did flying machines and weapons unknown to us really exist? To solve this problem, researchers noticed an interesting detail. According to ancient legends, Indian gods and heroes fight in heaven, not on dragons or birds, but on manned aircraft with superweapons on board. Moreover, the description contains a real technological basis. Aviation engineer from Germany, Algund Enbaum, conducted his research. He discovered that the ancient text of the Vimanika Shastra describes in detail the technologically high-flying vehicles of the Vimana. Moreover, it mentions the necessary diet for the pilot, about 32 secrets that a pilot should know in the management of a Viman, and even pays attention to safety during flights. But what are Vimanas? Vimanas were called something that illuminated the sky, gave a reflection. When an airplane appears in the sky in the rays of the sun, it sparkles and glares. And that is exactly how it is described in the Vedas. Then it is described that these vimanas had wheels. When they moved on the ground, there were footprints. When they started, the wind was so strong that houses were shaking, and trees were uprooted, and elephants ran away in panic. On May 28, 2010, on the territory of Liberia, American Special Services arrested Russian pilot Konstantin Yaroshenko and illegally transported him to the United States, where he was waiting for torture, a fabricated criminal case, and 20 years in prison. Does the Russian pilot have a chance to return home? God forbid, my son will die. I will burn a torch in front of the US Embassy in Moscow. And also, especially for REN TV, an exclusive interview with Konstantin Yaroshenko himself. What he will tell about his imprisonment. Documentary investigation, captivity. Tomorrow at 0 on REN TV. But did the Livamans really exist? And what role did they play in the history of India and the whole world? To answer this question, researchers delved into the study of Indian chronicles and found sensational details. It turns out that the mention of flying machines is contained in many ancient Indian texts, including the Vedas. This is how the approach of these machines is described in a text that dates back to no later than 2500th year BC. Houses and trees trembled, and small plants were uprooted by the terrifying wind. Caves in the mountains were filled with a roar, and the sky seemed to split into pieces or fall from the tremendous speed and mighty roar of the air carriage. In the third book of the ancient Indian epic Mahabharata, scientists have found a detailed description of a flying fortress. An air cruiser called Saubha attacked Krishna's city. In response, Krishna uses a universal anti-aircraft weapon, the throwing chakra. This, in general, is Vimana too, but only so big, having the appearance of a fortress. Because there are a lot of these demons on it, and they are shooting at Krishna's city from above. But then Krishna, in the end, using his wonderful weapon, his own chakra, this throwing disc, the sun. He throws this saber, this disc, and it incinerates this city and cuts through the shawls. It is necessary there, and so on. As a result of careful research, scientists managed to find out that in ancient India there were several types of aircraft that differed first of all in their purpose and appearance. Vimanas. Now it's hard to say what they are outwardly. But if we talk about some kind of superficial assessment to give these aircraft, they were, in my opinion, four types. And the most common were conical-shaped vimanas and winged vimanas, which could move not only vertically, but also horizontally. The Vaimanika Shastri says that these vimanas even had a retractable landing gear. Some vimanas had the ability to take off vertically, others needed a runway. The ancient chronicle describes in some detail that some types of vimanas had the shape of a wing and were accelerated on three wheels. From the point of view of Vaimanika Shastra, these aircraft could rise to a very high altitude, developed a very high speed, and served to ensure that those who moved on them, so that they moved at maximum speed for a minimum time over very long distances. And with the help of Vimans, it was possible to overcome the distance across the oceans in just a few minutes. However, vimanas were used not only as a vehicle. The instructions for pilots contain instructions for the behavior of air combat. Consequently, the aircraft of antiquity possessed weapons that allowed them to fight in the air. The range of interests of ancient people was much wider than one can imagine. Vimanas also carried deadly weapons. Just like modern airplanes, missiles, some kind of machine guns, cannons that destroy the enemy in the air, on the ground, on the water and so on, and even underwater. And in those days, the pilot who controlled the Vimana also possessed the art of conducting combat, with the help of a divine weapon, the Aslidi. One example of wars that were fought in the air is contained in the most popular Indian epic Aram and the City. Scientists, endologists, and specialists in the field of aviation, astronautics, studied the works on meteorology, comparing modern scientific data with what was reported by ancient books. The result was stunning. Most likely, they were jet or high-speed engines, as they were described in the Vedas, and as the Indians tried to portray them. There can be nothing else. After all, you can't stick a propeller in there. These are definitely aerodynamic technologies. The researchers went further. They began to study the alloy formulas for the Vimana device set out in the book. The study of ancient texts moved from the offices of scientists in the science lab. The result produced the effect of an exploding bomb. At the Symposium Science and Technology of Ancient India, scientist Naren Shah demonstrated 3 completely new substances that he obtained in the laboratory, according to the formulas described in the Vaimanika Shastra. Another scientist and specialist in Sanskrit, or appealed to the director of the Indian Government Department with a request to join forces to try to reproduce the alloys. In 1991st year, the obtained alloys were tested. Incredibly, the alloys revealed previously unknown properties, which made them suitable for use in modern aviation, spacecraft, and military affairs. And in September 1992, the newspaper India Express published that the text of Vaimanika Shastra is a guide to creating superalloys for the aviation of the future. As the main fuel, a method of heating mercury was used, due to which some kind of energy was somehow increased, maybe released, which acted as a jet thrust. But how is this possible? What could the ancient Indians know about jet propulsion? Did they really own the secrets of aeronautics? How did people who lived in immemorial times have such high technological knowledge? A thorough analysis of ancient texts has yielded more questions than answers. It is very unlikely that people could have done this 1,500 years ago. They didn't have the technology to build such a device on their own. At that time, many things were not invented at all. And what we see is very complex systems. You need to have an idea about aerodynamics, about control systems. And people at that time carried stones on their backs or dragged them along the rails, and did not have such special knowledge. At least we don't know about it, because there is little evidence from that era. Western scientists joined the research. After several years of careful research, they published the result. In California, at the University of San Jose, where the lead alloy described in the Shastra Vaimanika was tested, it was found that the alloy absorbs 85% of the energy emitted by a ruby laser, and the alloy of copper, zinc, and lead has good malleability and strong corrosion resistance. In addition, according to the instructions described in ancient texts, scientists have derived a high-quality ceramic material, which, after minor modification, allows you to get a very soft and acid-resistant glass. The results of the research were amazing because these discoveries break all the ideas of official history about the past of mankind. In order to somehow explain this phenomenon, the researchers put forward a seemingly incredible hypothesis. What if there was a highly developed civilization on Earth thousands of years ago, which was able to create superweapons and powerful aircraft? But if this is true, then where has this civilization disappeared? Scientist Alexander Gerodnitsky believes that the answer should be sought in the history of human development. Civilization on Earth did not develop progressively, from the bottom up always, as we were taught under dialectical materialism. First the primitive system, then the slave system, into the social structure. But in principle also the development of science and civilization, and that it could develop discreetly. In other words, some kind of advanced civilization developed, then it died as a result of a catastrophe. And everything started all over again. Melted stones in ancient cities, lakes are perfectly round in shape, more like craters from bomb explosions. High radioactive background in places where there have never been fossils that could emit it. All these findings give scientists the opportunity to assume that once our planet could have been a testing ground for nuclear tests. However, there is another version. Researcher James Moisson believes that thousands of years ago, the Earth was a battlefield for highly developed civilizations that did not want an atomic war on their planets. Yes, we have enough reason to believe that UFOs visited Earth hundreds of years ago, even thousands. And there is also evidence that there have even been wars between aliens on Earth. It's hard to believe, it's hard to prove. But we did research on various physical objects that I found. And we have come to the conclusion that aliens have indeed visited Earth before, and even fought here either among themselves or against someone. Both versions deserve the close attention of scientists. The famous German scientist Hartwig Hausdorff conducted his research and found in the ancient epics of different peoples of the world descriptions of fierce battles that were staged in the sky by powerful gods. But the most incredible thing is that the ancient authors describe it in such detail, as if they observed it with their own eyes. In one of my books, I published pictures of drawings from the Stone Age period. This is rock art that I found in caves in France and Spain. There, Stone Age people depicted some flying objects on the walls of caves, perhaps the gods they watched flying through the sky. But what were the heavenly creatures fighting for? For the domination of the earth, or is there some secret hidden here? Studying ancient manuscripts, scientists have put forward a truly revolutionary hypothesis, according to which guests from other planets did not just fight for dominance on Earth. They defended the right to be the first to populate the planet, giving rise to human civilization. While researching in China, I, the first non-Chinese in the world, was given special permission to visit closed military facilities. And there I found more than 100 pyramids. These pyramids are closely linked to the legends and myths of ancient China. They constantly talk about the legendary 5 emperors who ruled even before the first Chinese dynastic rulers came to power. And these ancient emperors never tired of repeating that their ancestors were not earthlings, but sons of heaven, who flew to Earth from outer space on fire-breathing metal dragons. And these myths appeared many thousands of years before our time. But if this hypothesis is correct, it turns out that the entire human race traces its lineage back to the gods. But is this possible? To confirm or refute this hypothesis, the researchers again turned to ancient texts. In one of the old Slavic epics, they found a description of the fierce battle of the gods for the right to love an earthly girl. The text says how bright flashes of lightning lit up the clear sky, and after a moment, the image of a mighty hero appeared out of the dazzling light. This is the god Perun. The patron saint of Slavic warriors rushes through the sky on a chariot of fire. God jumps to save his chosen one, a Slavic girl named Dodola, who was kidnapped by the cunning god Vels. Velez has fallen in love with Perun's wife, Makosh, and kidnaps her, hides her from her husband. And Perun chases Velez, thunders. According to an ancient legend, in order to return his beloved, the god Perun unleashed a real war on the heavenly Olympus. For 10 days, the earth was flooded with rain, the sky was illuminated by bright lightning, and thunder could be heard for hundreds of kilometers. And only after Perun almost destroyed the whole world, Vels returned the beautiful Dodola. For a long time, this old Slavic story was considered nothing more than a myth. However, more recently, historians have discovered an amazing fact. It turns out that the beautiful Dodola, because of whom the Slavic gods unleashed a bloody war, is not a fictional character, but a real person, a Russian girl who was famous for her unearthly beauty. But then, who were the Slavic gods really? Why did they fight for the right to love earthly women? Further research of ancient Slavic manuscripts revealed amazing details to historians. It turns out that after Perun managed to rescue his beloved from captivity, Dodola gave birth to a blonde boy, the first demigod on earth. The mythological idea that the gods converged with non-male women, conceived children from them, and the whole people we still had. In the South Slavic epic, too, heroes are often conceived from a snake. And this is again a link. Among the southern Slavs, it is very often the fiery snakes from heaven that are associated with Perun. The epic about the love of the earthly girl Dodola and the god Perun is central in the inventory of the ancient Slavs. Surprisingly, such stories are often found in Indian, Sumerian, Egyptian, and ancient Greek legends. The sun god Ra was the progenitor of all Egyptian pharaohs. From the love union of the Greek goddess Thetis and her mortal husband Peleus, the great warrior Achilles was born. All-powerful gods descended from heaven and loved earthly women, and heroes were born from these unions. The chosen children, to whom the gods passed on some of their knowledge, had unique abilities. They could see the future, control the forces of nature, heal people, and create real magic. So a race of superhumans appeared on Earth. The Earth's climate was not suitable enough for immortals and for immortal beings. Therefore, it is quite obvious that for the normal management of the planet and the organization of a certain civilization on it, some intermediate species were needed that would combine, on the one hand, some genetic characteristics of their creators themselves, but on the other hand, and perhaps those forms of life that were already on the planet. The descendants of the gods became the head of the civilization they created. That is why all the heroes of the epics and legends, all the great warriors and generals appearing in myths, necessarily belong to the higher castes of society. And they are the creators of heaven bestowed a heavy-duty weapon, with which they had to protect his people. Many representatives of the Egyptian nobility, Egyptian pharaohs, and the priesthood, in fact, were probably descendants of that very race. And a reliable description of ancient weapons is contained in the ancient Indian epics. Incredible bows of Shiva and Arjuna, the strategic weapon of astrovision, which destroyed hundreds of thousands of people. Where did the ancients get such means of warfare? Perhaps these are the gifts of the gods, which were presented only to the most worthy of people. So what kind of weapons, types of weapons are described? Very different, including of unearthly origin. In particular, there are weapons of Shiva, weapons on Rayana. That is, beings from higher planets were brought here in some cases. Well, for example, a weapon based on water. Or, let's say, a weapon that is based on the action of fire, and for some reason neutralizes one another. One of the worst tools in the arsenal of the ancient people of the Indian epics referred to as Narayana. Its action is described with the colorful metaphors, the meaning of which becomes apparent when the document is taken research scientist. Such a universal cold comes, you know, when there is such a weapon on Ryan, when everything freezes in general. It's just that if, in the language of modern physics, let's say classical, that is, this Brownian motion, it just stops. Everything just freezes and stops. This is the type of weapon described. However, even the most worthy could not cope with the received power. The annals and myths indicate that the priceless gifts of the gods, in the hands of the ancient people, brought, in the end, grief and destruction of civilization. Contact with earthlings was quite physical and very active. And, taking into account these factors, it was in no way possible to take into account the factor of spirituality in the transfer of knowledge, which later, as I said, did not have a very positive, rather a negative impact on the fate of our civilization. And at some point after the last catastrophe, it was the fall of a large Azores planetoid, 13,665 years ago, into the Azores region, which led to terrible destruction and displacement of the Earth's orbit and so on. This is the period when a powerful decline began on Earth. This decline, he touched, among other things, the knowledge that Earthlings had received by that time, the remnants of the lost civilizations scattered over the Earth. Super technologies were irretrievably lost, and scattered knowledge was enough only to keep humanity from extinction. But even these crumbs have formed civilizations that today's historians call great. Knowledge was fragmented, and they somehow formed the civilization of Sumer, the Chinese civilization, the Egyptian civilization in later times, Atlantis, Hyperborea, Pechifida. These are all parts of a once unified, but already fragmented knowledge. And this knowledge, already in a fragmented form, is what we call today a kind of sacred knowledge. What is today called secret knowledge, the remnants of incredible technologies many thousands of years ago, transferred to humans by alien creators. Sacred knowledge. Of course, such knowledge exists and it existed. This knowledge was obtained, as I have already said, from ancient times, from a civilization of a very high level of development. And they have in a certain way and critically influenced the history of our civilization, the history of how everything began to take shape here. The destroyed civilizations of the past remained only in ancient documents. But today, humanity has found itself on the approaches to the same technologies, large-scale and intimidating. It seems incredible, but this point in the development of mankind has already been predicted. The Vedas are not the product of human intelligence. In other words, they were given to people ready-made. Well, that is, even now, among the remaining Vedas, we can find descriptions of such things that modern science did not dream of at all. That is, a description of various planets, life forms that live on different planetary systems. There's a lot of stuff there. Description of the aircraft that are used when moving between different planets. They can move, they use the energy of the ether. There is a prediction there that after a while, people will think of it and build such devices, that is, this is our future in the near future. Artifacts and structures that have come down to us from the time when the gods shared their technologies with people also have a meaning and purpose. Thanks to them, humanity remembers that the impossible does not exist, and all that was presented to us as a gift, we will one day be able to create with our own hands. And it's not even that we can't build it. It's just that the problem is that we feel that it was done with the help of some higher forces. And this is exactly what our ancestors tell us. They say the things we used to do with the gods. But it wasn't the end of the world. It's not just aliens who came to Earth and built this for us. This is what we have built with the help of extraterrestrial beings. This is what tells us how we should surpass ourselves, and we should strive to surpass ourselves. And when we do things like this, the final result is something beautiful, something magical, something that will always exist, something that will truly be a miracle of the world. The legacy of the ancient gods has another purpose. Ancient texts say that people who have not reached the highest level of spiritual growth should not get their hands on truly powerful technologies of destruction, because as a result, it may turn out that the legends about us and our children will be studied according to myths and legends a million years after the next end of the world. There is another version explaining exactly how a weapon of monstrous destructive power could have fallen into the hands of our distant ancestors. And in this case, myths come to the aid of researchers again. Russian researchers are convinced that the ancient heroes possessed technologies that allowed them to move to a huge space. And therefore, in the view of distant descendants, they became gods. Moreover, the names of the gods of different countries turn out to be the same names for verification. Described, in principle, the same gods. The same Greek god Apollo is the sun god. This is the same as our Slavic god Kupala, which, in fact, sounds exactly the same. The Greeks described Apollo as a blue-eyed, blonde-haired god who flew in a golden chariot drawn by swans. From the country of the north wind of Hyperborea, that is, from modern Russia. The same thing, Hercules with his exploits. Apparently, this is in some form a distorted myth about one of our ancient Slavic heroes named Yaroslav. The fact is that, again, from the point of view of philology, the name Hercules, which translates as glory to the goddess Hera, is written as Hegroclaus, if only it were written in letters. And this here, Heroclaus, is purely our Yaroslav. That's what we also translated as glory to Yar. But only Hera is a female hypostasis, and Yar is a male one. Scientists discover traces of an ancient civilization on all continents and continents. According to the researchers, this may indicate that there were several high-tech states with approximately the same level of development throughout the planet. Indeed, expeditions were many, and each expedition has its own features, its own nuances. Whether it is an expedition to the remote place of death, to Yakutia, whether it is an expedition to Cambodia, to some complex or to Egypt, there are always many facts and nuances that indicate that civilization in ancient times had a fairly high level of development.
достаточно высоким уровнем развития.
Scientists are convinced that the level of development of these civilizations was so high that they could influence geological and climatic processes. Today, humanity is only getting closer to understanding the real possibilities of influencing the climate. Before that, for 200 years, the only result in this area was the greenhouse effect. It was only in the first century that humanity came close to developing climate weapons. But thanks to the sensational discoveries of scientists, it can be argued that ancient people had a whole arsenal that allows them to control the weather. Climate is an amazing thing in general, and with the help of climate, you can manage the state very easily, arrange droughts, floods, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions. And it is quite possible that the ancient people, just using this weapon and subjugating themselves, on the one hand, with the power of nature, they were able to create a paradise on earth. When they want it to rain, when they don't want it, it doesn't rain and the sun shines, grass grows, everything is fine. According to the chronicles, the Egyptian pyramids did not stand in the desert. Ancient maps and modern research indisputably prove that once rivers flowed near these cyclopean structures, the course of which can still be detected with the help of special archaeological equipment, and gardens bloomed around the pyramids. But, according to one version, it was experiments with climate weapons that caused the extinction of the oldest civilization. It wasn't a war of the worlds. It was a war between man and nature. It is quite possible that the ancient inhabitants just played a little too much. And, having played with these weather phenomena, they could also get both an ice age and a shift of the belts, and a flood that could easily flood Atlantis, destroy Hyperborea, Lemuria, and many other countries. Researchers of ancient civilizations insist that the number of prehistoric mankind was quite low, compared to the modern scale of settlement of the planet. High-tech civilization does not imply social stratification. It does not need numerous personnel servicing machines. It does not need a service sector, and the level of development is so high that the class of beggars and unemployed who today make up the majority of the world's population, is simply impossible. All the high-tech civilizations that inhabited our planet hundreds of thousands of years ago could hardly have totaled more than a few million people. People are hardly confused. There is one person for tens and hundreds of kilometers. Naturally, people were quite compact. They built cities, built temples, certain structures, roads, flew to each other, quite possibly on flying ships. There is a phenomenal structure in the South African Republic, an airfield that has never been built by anyone. When the colonists came to this mysterious place in the 20th century and began to choose the optimal point for the construction of the runway, it was found suspiciously quickly. After clearing the area, they saw perfectly laid stone slabs. Well, yes, they were a little overgrown there with some bushes and so on, but in fact, they only had to build a few household structures. And that was it, the airfield was ready. A local resident says that yes, that's all it was, we've been living here for how long? Our grandfathers, grandmothers. It's all still there. Researchers and archaeologists have found more than 20 such sites around the world. And none of the locals had the slightest idea who and when built the runways in these places. Researchers obviously, it was here that the places of compact residence of ancient people were located. And it is in this compactness, it seems, that the secret of the sudden disappearance of a civilization of the distant past lies. With compact settlement, it is very easy for a civilization to be destroyed because any seismological phenomena, earthquakes, floods, again, any strikes, including nuclear weapons, but in fact destroy an entire hearth of civilization. Climate weapons are not the only version of the disappearance of ancient civilizations. Researchers no longer question the fact that their level of development was seriously ahead of the modern world. Therefore, the range of self-destruction tools was extremely wide. What we call sacred knowledge today is a certain amount of knowledge that has been preserved in one form or another. And it originates precisely from civilizations of a very high level of development, ancient civilizations, in the true sense of antediluvian civilizations. And this knowledge, they had a very serious impact on the fate of our current civilization. Humanity, which today is called prehistoric, was developed not only and not so much technologically. Scientists who are engaged in the research of ancient civilizations agree that the man of that time was radically different from us. First of all, with abnormal abilities. The inhabitants of our planet at that time had completely different abilities. And the mind and memory and, in general, all abilities were much higher than they are now. And accordingly, different aircraft were also used, and even different types of weapons were used. Aircraft equipped with sophisticated weapons are mentioned in the vast majority of prehistoric chronicles, from the legends of Central America to the myths of ancient China. Moreover, most of them indicate that our distant ancestors could freely move not only on the surface of the planet, but also travel between the stars. Used a variety of aircraft, including they were traveling on the aircraft with the higher planets. Together with the inhabitants of the higher planets, they traveled on their ships. Among other historical evidence, interplanetary ships and voyages between worlds are described, both in the epics of the peoples of Northern Europe and in the Indian Vedas. According to scientists, this is another indication that the West and East Eurasia inhabited to of technogenic civilization, the same power. Creatures are endowed with superpowers and, in fact, able to fly, move to others, including to other planets. There is a lot about this in the Indian Vedas, and, by and large, there is a lot about it in the Scandinavian myths. It was the Scandinavian epics that prompted researchers to think that our planet was once the starting point for intergalactic travel. The word planet was not used then because the planet was stuck in the Greek prompting star, then it's all called Earth. Here is our planet Earth. Midgard was one of many, and the ancient Scandinavians knew it. Again, the gods lived on another planet called Asgard. Other representatives, giants, lived on another planet. And Scandinavian myths tell about it. They talk about the wars that occurred between these groups. Evidence of interplanetary flights and star wars, in which our planet was involved, is found in various corners of the planet. One of the most high-profile discoveries confirming this theory was made in the last century by Japanese researchers from the University of Tokyo. The study of Dogu statues attracted the interest of the scientific community around the world. And, ultimately, it was this artifact, whose age is estimated in thousands of years, that was taken as a basis for the development of a spacesuit for American astronauts. I know of at least a few examples of images of prehistoric astronauts. Dogu statues from Japan are the most famous of them, about this size. They are dated to the Gemin period, that is, about 6,000 years before the birth of Christ. These figures have easily recognizable details of a space suit, that is, helmets, fasteners, and so on. In the 60s, pictures of these figures and the results of examinations were sent to NASA. And based on these images, NASA has created its own spacesuit for astronauts. An amazing find was made in the Kaluga region. Stone heads were found there, dressed in something like a part of a spacesuit. There is a hose in the mouth area, possibly for oxygen supply. You can then take the picture from my book. At the beginning of last year, the scientific world was blown up by another sensation. Recent studies of ancient manuscripts from Indian repositories, until recently closed from the uninitiated, have once again confirmed the fact that India was the center of one of the prehistoric civilizations, with a developed infrastructure and advanced military technologies. Historical documents of India speak of a civilization that existed on Earth millions of years ago. They also described some of their stuff. First of all, they had spaceships and airplanes, which in the manuscripts were called vimanas, and descriptions of various types of vimans, ancient spaceships and airplanes are given. And also an ancient weapon was described, which we can attribute to nuclear weapons. They also mention huge cities and other signs that are inherent in a highly developed civilization. The problem is that all of this has not been preserved after millions of years. Moreover, these chronicles preserve not only evidence of the existence of a highly developed civilization, but also evidence of contacts with other worlds. And in this version, the aliens were unfavorable gods, the giver of earthlings the benefits of civilization, equal partners, and sometimes strategic military opponents. Yes, ancient manuscripts have descriptions of spaceships. We can call them UFOs. For example, there was a UFO case described in an ancient manuscript, a spaceship made of iron or steel. It was obtained by a king on this land, named Shalova. He got this ship from extraterrestrial civilizations, from a being who was an engineer of extraterrestrial civilizations. The slut king used a UFO, or a spaceship that he received from an alien, to attack a city on Earth called Dvorka. The city of Dvorka still exists in northwestern India. The document, about which the famous American scientist Michael Crimo speaks, says that Shalva received his combat vehicle in exchange for the weapons he possessed. This document stated that one of the weapons this king had was something like a flash of lightning. Part of the city was destroyed by this energy weapon. It also said that when this spaceship attacked the city, it flew in a very unusual way. Sometimes he would appear in several places at once, and sometimes he would appear in only one place. His movements were very unusual, incomparable with the movements of our aircraft today. His movements were described as the movement of a butterfly. This was described in a text 5,000 years ago. Today, many descriptions that people give about UFOs are very similar to these ancient testimonies. An ancient description of a UFO that attacked the ancient city of Dvorkovich in ancient India. Another military conflict, also preserved in the form of a legend, has come down to us from two sources at once, from the Scandinavian countries and from India. Historians assume that we are talking about the same war, in which the peoples of the northwestern and southeastern parts of Eurasia came together. The Vikings called it the War of the Aces and Giants, the Hindus, the War of the Devas and Asuras. Moreover, in later interpretations, the sides of darkness and good changed places several times. In India, this is a war of smoke and Asuras, where the Devas were good gods and the Asuras were bad gods. In Iran, the ideology is a little different, so the Asurs were good gods. Actually, Ahura Mazda is known to everyone. And the virgins were evil demons that the good gods fought with. The echo of this war was reflected in many legends and in many peoples, including the myth of ancient Greece about the battle of the gods and titans, as well as the ancient Sumerians and Egyptians. Absolutely the same thing. Accordingly, there were gods, there were titans who were relatives, and some were children of others, and so on, but nevertheless, the gods overthrew the titans and began to rule themselves. The same thing, by and large, can be traced in Sumerian mythology, in Egyptian mythology, That is, the plot is absolutely the same on the territory of our entire planet, which distinguishes some two races of superbeings, who did not wage war with each other, but periodically there was also a period when they existed peacefully. Who exactly participated in this war, what was its cause and how it ended, it is no longer possible to reliably find out, except for the obvious fact that its result was the destruction of all participants in the conflict. But there are details that can be used to judge the civilization of superhumans who own weapons of great power and possess superpowers. One of them is an unknown alloy, which, after dozens, and perhaps hundreds and thousands of centuries, is decorated with statues of Garuda, a ritual mount in Hindu temples of the god Vishnu. Its origin remains a mystery, and its composition baffles physicists and chemists. At the entrance to every Vishnu temple, there is such a column. There is a Garuda on it. Here. And these are some of the columns in question. That is, in Pura, in particular, this column and the sign of Vishnu, which is located at the top of the temple, crowns the temple with such a wheel of chakra. It was just made with the help of such Vedic technologies, with the help of mantras. And the purity of this metal, it does not lend itself to any modern awareness at all. However, this version of the ancient wars has its own prophecy. And as in the case of divine or alien intervention, it is, on the one hand, full of optimism and faith in people. On the other hand, it is a severe warning. It says that after a while, there is such a prediction given, people will again have access to such technology, and will build such aircraft. However, both of these versions raise a lot of questions from traditional science. And the main argument given by the supporters of the conservative Darwinian theory of the origin of man at first seems indisputable. Archaeological research conducted by the most modern method of radiometric dating and uranium analysis clearly indicates that the first signs of intelligent life number a maximum of 10,000 years. But more recently, this thesis has been completely refuted. And in order to protest it, it took quite a bit. It turned out to be sufficient to assume that several thousand years ago, our planet experienced a severe nuclear war. In the mid-70s, a series of articles appeared in Soviet scientific journals, which went unnoticed by anyone except a small group of specialists. Scientists have discovered the remains of stone cities in Central Asia, almost completely covered with sand. There was nothing surprising in the discovery of stone houses, if not for one important detail. This stone was melted down and even looked like glass. That is, it was a fever. These cities were destroyed by a heat that surpassed a normal bonfire. And then the idea arose that it was the result of a nuclear explosion. Similar traces were found on the walls of the ancient city of Mohenjo-daro in Pakistan. The masonry is melted by temperatures that are simply impossible in the conditions of the Middle Ages. Further research showed that the city was burned and destroyed, but neither in it nor nearby. Not a single burial was found. It's as if hundreds of people just disappeared in an instant. Trying to solve this mystery of antiquity, researchers put forward a version that the city was destroyed by a nuclear strike. But it was not easy to confirm it. None of the legends mention such a powerful weapon, which is comparable to an atomic bomb in terms of the strength of its defeat. Historians have already despaired, but unexpectedly found in the Indian epic Mahabharata, mention of the mystical weapon astrovidya, the description of which perfectly fits the definition of a tactical nuclear missile. In the Mahabharata, it is mentioned that Arjuna, when pursuing enemies, used the heavenly weapon of the island, the art of controlling which he learned from famous teachers of military art and from demigods.
Он использовал небесное оружие, астровидию, искусство управления которым он научился у известных учителей военного искусства и у полубогов.
They even asked for it without using this wondrous weapon of Origin, because it is brighter than thousands of suns and pierces the embryos in the womb of mothers. Arjuna is the hero of the ancient Indian epic Mahabharata. Some researchers believe that this is a real historical figure, a ruler, and a great warrior, with weapons of colossal destructive power. But if this is indeed the case, and Arjun has mastered the weapons of the demigods, so there must have been traces of its use on the ground. It seems incredible, but after a thorough study, scientists have found such traces. I am interested in questions concerning how nuclear weapons were at the disposal of ancient people and why they waged wars with each other. Most reliable descriptions of nuclear weapons have been preserved in Indian epics. But how did the distant ancestors of modern Indians manage to develop their civilization to a level that surpasses the technological capabilities of modern science? The ancient Indian civilization is a very peculiar and interesting culture because, for example, they said that they fought in the sky, that they had extraordinary flying machines, that they could do such things, which, in fact, was similar to nuclear explosions. Well, or at least today, we could attribute them to a nuclear explosion. It is in the Indian epics that one of the most destructive nuclear battles in the history of the planet is described. This is an illustration from the ancient epic Mahabharata depicting the Battle of Kurukshetra. According to an ancient text, the war was caused by a dynastic struggle for the throne of Hastinapura between two clans of cousins, the Kauravas and the Pandavas. Arjuna belonged to the family of the latter. However, not all researchers agree with this point of view. Studying ancient legends, scientists are increasingly coming to the conclusion that many thousands of years ago, there was a nuclear war between the ancient inhabitants of the earth, the Asuras and the gods, which led to an environmental catastrophe and a change in living conditions on our planet. Because everything that is described in it, this great battle on the Kuru field, is like a continuation, or an earthly version. A continuation of the great eternal battle of the gods and their antagonists, the opponents of the Asuras, transferred to earth. Not to say the demons, because it is rather similar to the Indian, Inagratesa Titans. Such are simply opponents of the gods, anti-gods. Today, the Kuru fields, the place where that terrible battle began, are considered sacred. The legend says that thousands of years ago, it killed more than 500 million people. But such a number of warriors simply cannot fit on such a field. Scientists are convinced that this figure can be true only under one condition, if the war was going on all over the continent. This battle took place about 5,000 years ago, on the territory of modern India near Delhi. This place is called Kurukshetra. This is a very famous place, a holy place, and the biggest battle took place in this holy place. Then, according to various sources, about 640 million people died. It was a very big battle. Confirmation that the battle on the field of Kuru, mentioned in the Mahabharata, actually stretched from the Indian to the Atlantic Ocean, can be the fact that the legend of this battle in one form or another has been preserved not only by the Indians. There is a lot in common with the epics of different peoples, but mainly with the epics of peoples who have ever lived in the middle belt of Eurasia, in the Eurasian steppe. Researchers of both ancient Indian and ancient Slavic history in their works proceed from the fact that the events described in the Mahabharata took place several thousand years ago. But then the question arises why, in such a relatively short period of time, all significant artifacts disappeared. Where are the skeletons of interplanetary ships? Where are the remnants of factories and huge super-technological productions? Where are the remains of those billions of people who obviously died before mammoths and dinosaurs? Researcher and author of the bestseller Forbidden Archaeology, Michael Cremo, has his own version on this score. The teachers I had at school and at the university said that the first person like us appeared less than 150,000 years ago. Therefore, the idea that humans existed several million years ago was new to me. I became interested. Are these ancient documents really something like chronicles? Or are these mythological records? I started doing research on the history of archaeology. Why do all modern textbooks and many scientific articles on archaeology describe only those discoveries that support the official dominant theory of Darwinian evolution? And he had a feeling, turning into confidence, that the data was carefully filtered for a specific purpose to convince the world that people like us first appeared less than 150,000 years ago, having evolved from ape-like ancestors. But when I look through something other than textbooks, for example, the originals of scientific reports in different languages, from the time of Darwin to the present, I find many descriptions of human bones, artifacts, human footprints that date back millions of years. It was very surprising. The scientist conducted a detailed study of the sources, raised archaeological reports from the time when they appeared at all, and began to be systematized. The result amazed the scientist himself. What I found was very different from the discoveries described in textbooks. I think the dating method is based on precise scientific principles. For example, in the period of decay of various radioactive elements. But in any case, this dating method may not always be correct due to contamination of samples. So, the researcher has approached a point that threatens to completely turn the whole of archaeology as a science. The radiocarbon method and the method of isotope analysis, which until now were considered the most advanced, modern and accurate means of determining the age of finds, give a serious failure if the object has already been exposed to radiation. Therefore, I believe that dating methods are based on precise scientific principles. But in each particular case, they may be wrong. Yes, my theory is that people like us existed millions of years ago. A lot of studies prove this. Some of them relate to the fairly modern history of archaeology, and some to the ancient history of archaeology. This discovery can put into place all the mysteries associated with ancient nuclear wars, turn the idea of human history upside down, and answer the most unexpected questions. In the light of this theory, it becomes clear not only why it is impossible to find traces of a large-scale ancient Indian war with millions of victims today, but also, for example, why the entire continent west of India is densely strewn with lakes of almost perfectly round shape. These are craters from exploding bombs. Can we be similar in the first approximation? My opinion is as follows. Shock structures of space objects, for example. You could say that. However, to consider these lakes as a consequence of a meteor shower prevents several important circumstances at once. It remains unclear why they are scattered all over the continent, and why they are all about the same diameter. There are other, much more significant signs that indicate a completely terrestrial and even man-made origin of these lakes. How are they different? Well, I think the greater such a centering, apparently, of the location of the nuclear charge itself, and the greater its accentuation, symmetry, perhaps, because, as Yevgeny Gadovich said, after all, cosmic bodies have an angle of incidence, and there, so to speak, consequences. On the Earth's surface, in the form of an imprint, or some series of products of this contact. These are still some kind of avoidance structures, it seems to me. That is, these are ellipses, this is, so to speak, this. And the funnel is still from a nuclear explosion. If there is one, it must be a kind of cone. This is exactly a ground-based nuclear explosion. In order to leave a circular funnel, a celestial body must fall strictly perpendicular to the Earth. Meteorites fly with great speed to the rotating Earth. And even if several of them hit the Earth's crust at the required angle, it would be a vanishing small percentage of the total mass of irregular oval funnels. In the case of the Siberian and Ural lakes, the option with celestial bodies is not suitable due to purely geometric reasons. This is some kind of a central type of structure, whose root goes to the depth and along the edges, respectively. It is expressed more in such a non-oval, but more concentric circular shape. The geography of the funnel lakes is extremely wide. If we take as a basis that these are the traces of nuclear attacks, there is confidence that humanity has survived the world nuclear war. I can say that these circular lakes are not only from India to Russia, they are in general, these round lakes, scattered all over the world. Moreover, many craters reach such amazing sizes, absolutely correct, proportional, that if we assume that these are craters from nuclear explosions, then by and large, bombs exploded there that were 10 times more powerful than those bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The result of such a war could be irreversible changes in the life of the planet. Perhaps the complete destruction of advanced man-made civilizations was not the only consequence of the nuclear conflict. The researchers suggest that the Earth could change the axis of rotation and even the orbit of the cloud of radioactive ash, inevitably had to provoke the most serious environmental changes. If the scientists are right, and this was the case, another mystery of the distant past is being explained. We can say that the war was so intense that, quite possibly, it could later affect the climate, lead to a nuclear winter. The very ice-cold period that, naturally, scientists recognize and believe that it existed, but it is quite possible that it was, in fact, a consequence of this war. The consequences of the ancient nuclear conflict are even greater than could have been expected. Humanity has memorized it at the level of genetic memory. Perhaps that is why today, so many large international organizations are engaged exclusively in trying to restrain the development of nuclear potential and limit as much as possible the number of countries with a red button. And perhaps that is why the funnel lakes, which remind us of the terrible events of antiquity, are notorious among the local population, despite the fact that they have completely lost radioactivity. There are a lot of these funnels, there are a lot of them on the territory of Russia. And what is quite interesting is that on the territory of Russia, I have seen these funnels myself. Many locals try to bypass these places by the country, considering them cursed. They give them a very interesting name, Dead Lake, Shaitan Lake, Devil Lake, and so on. That is, again, this is due to some kind of hereditary memory, which suggests that the lake somehow was not formed in a very kind way, and its formation did not bring anything good. It turns out that the ancient people really had access to nuclear technology. And scientists found another proof of this seemingly incredible theory in the Hebrew mystical book Kabbalah. The Book of Secret Knowledge, which was declassified only in 1993, describes one of the sacred objects of Christianity, the Ark of the Covenant, as a nuclear reactor. After all, in the Bible itself, in principle, there are not so many mentions of him. It says that people who touched this ark received an electric shock and died. But the Hebrew Kabbalah tells about a lot of secrets associated with it. She describes it in more detail. It had a small nuclear reactor, which for many years produced an electric current. And the same apparatus produced the same manna from heaven by photosynthesis. Malt sugar was produced from a special kind of algae by hydrolysis, which the Israelites ate for 40 years, while they wandered in the desert. In ancient texts, there is a mention of the supernatural properties of the ark. According to legend, when the ark was transported from Kiriath and Arim on a new chariot, on the way its shafts tilted strongly, and Oz stretched out his hand to hold it. But the Lord was angry with him, and smote him because he stretched out his hand to the ark, and he died immediately. However, not all researchers agree with the version of divine wrath. Speaking of the Ark of the Covenant, I am absolutely convinced that inside this box, which was then moved around the earth, there was a certain device in the center, which also had an alien origin. But what kind of device was it, and why was it installed inside the ark? The famous German researcher Kausdorff adheres to the version that the Ark of the Covenant was a kind of miniature nuclear power plant, inside of which there was a nuclear reactor. The version of the German scientist is indirectly confirmed by the sacred texts. According to the biblical description, the ark was a golden chest, inside of which there was a wooden box. And there was another casket made of lead. Hausdorff is convinced that this is the optimal protection for a nuclear reactor. Moreover, the Ark of the Covenant was in the tabernacle, and then in the Jerusalem temple. That is, it was always stored behind a residential area. Only special priest porters who placed the shrine on long poles could move the Ark of the Covenant. Touching the Ark was strictly forbidden. If there really was a nuclear reactor, then it should still emit radiation. One of the tracks leads to the small island of Oak Island, which is located off the coast of Canada. It's a tiny island called Oak Island. Here, for 150 years, researchers have been trying to get to the bottom of one of the flooded mines. Scientists who lowered probes there to determine the age of the structure got incredible results. The modern radioisotope analysis gave 3 different results after 3 identical 11th century of our era, the 2000th year of our era, and 3100th year of our era. Obviously, there is strong radioactive radiation at the bottom of the mine, which distorts the results of the analysis. But whether this version has been verified is unknown. A few years ago, the mine was blocked by the special services, and all further research is classified. I received this information from knowledgeable people who work in the government, in the intelligence services that are part of this system. Another phenomenal find, testifying to the nuclear wars of the distant past, was discovered in the 70s, in the African state of Gabon. A French company that was developing a uranium ore deposit here unexpectedly discovered that the uranium content of 235 in the extracted raw materials was significantly lower than expected. It turned out that the uranium deposit in Gabon has such outlines that, taking into account the half-life of uranium, it can be concluded, almost 2 billion years ago, or rather, 1,750,000,000 years ago, there were 14 nuclear reactors here. All this has been calculated by physicists with great accuracy. Who could have created a nuclear reactor so many years ago? Skeptics and supporters of conservative science immediately began to look for an explanation for this phenomenon, and seem to have found it. There was a version that this is a unique random coincidence. It was in this place that the delta of the river was located. The water washed out almost all the elements from the granite, and a chain nuclear reaction began. But this explanation only seemed reliable because it justified only one oddity. The authors of the revelatory versions failed to explain a few more oddities of the Gabonese deposit. 13 more similar places are located outside the Delta River, And more importantly, substances designed to block the nuclear reaction and stop the reactor were found in soil samples. And the origin of these substances is impossible to explain by natural causes. There is another consequence that has been talked about relatively recently. Recent studies have given scientists the opportunity to assume that the war was going on all over the continent. But those peoples who retreated strictly to the east had the opportunity to defend themselves from constant nuclear airstrikes. Therefore, they were able to prevent mutations that are inevitable in the case of severe radiation. But those who went north or south did not have such protection. The same Mongoloid, today scientists have proved that, by and large, this is one of the first signs of radioactive mutations. The fact is that despite the fact that representatives of the Mongoloid race today are the ethnic majority on the planet, nevertheless, in ancient times, representatives of the Mongoloid race met not only in Asia, they also met in Africa and in Europe, and in Norway, in Scandinavia, in England, and so on. In other words, there are relevant studies by anthropologists that show this. It is quite possible that specifically the same Mongoloid race was the result of either the same genetic experiments or either it was the consequences of some kind of nuclear war or something else. Today, it is obvious to almost all scientists that thousands, and possibly millions of years ago, our planet experienced a nuclear war, and the danger of flirting with a nuclear reaction turns out to be much more obvious than it could have been assumed, because, in addition to authoritative statements by scientists, in addition to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in addition to Chernobyl and Semipalatinsk, humanity already has a huge number of warnings and forbidding signs. They are many millions of years old, but this does not prevent you from seeing them in their entirety, in order to get off the dangerous road in time. One of the greatest science fiction writers of the 20th century, Isaac Asimov, once said that perfect technology is outwardly indistinguishable from magic. The writer, who predicted many phenomena and things from our future, and, in fact, created the science of political forecasting called psychohistory, turned out to be right in this. Researchers who have approached myths and legends from these positions have come to absolutely amazing results. Perhaps the magical items and wonderful weapons that are constantly mentioned in fairy tales and legends are nothing but high technology, improved to such an extent that the uninitiated were sure that they were dealing with dangerous combat magic. What people took for a miracle, devices, let's say, technical, energy, whatever, more advanced, naturally, of course. It was perceived as divine. That is, there is no doubt about it. Well, sometimes, really, it's not divine, but diabolical, right? The surviving legends about mystical weapons, as a rule, put it in the hands of the gods. These are the hammer of Thor, and the spear of Odin, and the sword of the prophet Zulfikar, and the heavenly sword of Kusunaga, come from the Japanese islands. But the pantheon of the gods of ancient Greece is considered to be the most saturated cult with all kinds of attributes. And so it was from there that the researchers began their work. Incredibly, most of the sacred objects of the Greek gods today have analogues or prototypes. There are a lot of interesting artifacts of the gods of Greece in general. Hermes had magical winged sandals that allowed him to move through the sky with amazing speed, which again, I think, will be reinvented. Well, I think within the next 10 to 15 years, the god Poseidon had a magical trident with which he could control the weather. Waves again could hit enemies.
Бога Посейдона был волшебный трезубец, с помощью которого он опять-таки мог управлять погодой, волнами, мог поражать врагов.
The goddess Artemis had a bow, according to descriptions, very similar to the bow of the god Shiva. with which she could hit a target at crazy distances.
Она могла поражать цель на сумасшедших расстояниях.
Bows that shoot at great distances, whose arrows are able to find a target themselves, are present in almost all pagan cults. Skeptics consider this to be nothing more than an invention of ancient authors. However, researchers from science oppose them. Today, such bows already exist, and they are called homing missiles, capable of overcoming up to 300 kilometers, independently finding a target and hitting it with an accuracy of several millimeters. If it shoots, it means a bow, that is it. That is, they will have a bow and a rocket launcher. They will have a bow and the bow itself. By and large, their arrow can be understood as a small rocket, as a bullet, so they can have an arrow, respectively, and a rocket carrying a nuclear charge. Actually, exactly the same arrow can be lightning, which, some kind of electric discharge is directed. There will also be an arrow here, with a sword too. This, again, here we are talking about the fact that this is a weapon that is held in the hands, which is held in the hands, and the basis, which is finding it in his hands. Scientists are adamant. In most cases, when ancient epics mention wondrous weapon, we are talking about advanced technology, and not on the human imagination. The gods certainly had superpowers. And what is Zeus was a thunderer. With the help of a device of some kind, or not a device, or by the power of his thought, he caused electrical discharges. It's a superpower, and very powerful. Information about another wonderful weapon, which has obvious signs of high technology, is present in the historical chronicle of the Egyptians. In the 13th century BC, at a certain stage of the development of the two powers, the Egyptian and the Hittite, strange competitors became cramped in one territory. The result was immediate. War was declared, and two huge armies came together in one of the largest battles in the history of mankind. The battle is described in great detail. There she represents interests in an ambitious way for historians, for people studying military affairs, but nevertheless, there is one very interesting description. The fact is that when the pharaoh lost the battle, he used a very interesting artifact. He put on his head a kind of diadem crown, on which there was a snake Uraeus. The Uraeus snake has always been a symbol in Egypt, a symbol, a talisman, a symbol of the royal dynasty. Legend has it that this crown was given to the Egyptian rulers as a gift from the gods, and the snake depicted on it is the animated eye of one of them. The giver set his own eye in the royal headdress, giving its bearer incredible abilities. Researchers are convinced, on the one hand, this legend is intended to symbolize the constant observation of the Lord over all his subjects. But on the other hand, when the Egyptian army began to lose, the eye of God suddenly manifested itself as an unprecedented, powerful magical weapon. Actually, initially it was the eye of one of the gods of the Creator, who later went on an independent journey, decided to separate himself in some way and start living an independent life. He was depicted as a cobra snake. Actually, the description of the battle says that this eye came to life and began to study the bright burning light, which actually turned the entire Hittite army into flight.
Яркий прожигающий свет, который фактически обернул в бегство все хетское войско.
Moreover, a huge number of Hittite warriors were simply paralyzed, and the pharaoh joyfully found and cut off their heads, because they could not do anything simply. There are a lot of descriptions about this, a lot of research. The weapons really existed. Then where did it disappear to? There should have been information in the legends about who became its owner after the victorious pharaoh. However, here the researchers encountered encountered unexpected difficulties. The same motif is invariably present in the texts about the miraculous weapon. It remains in the hands of the owner as long as he uses it for protection. As soon as it becomes a weapon of attack, obeying its owner, the owner of a wonderful thing dies, and the artifact itself disappears forever. Is this the fate that befell the mysterious weapons of the ancient Egyptians? The fact is that this diadem is a crown. It was passed down from generation to generation. It actually kept the Egyptian ruling dynasty, but at some point it was lost. Incredibly, this seemingly exclusively mythological pattern also has a rational scientific explanation. Legends say that only rulers could own unique weapons. Otherwise, it just didn't work. But how to understand that the weapon fell into the hands of the chosen one? To answer this question, the researchers have done a tremendous amount of work and have come to incredible conclusions. In order to make it easier to explain the mechanism described in ancient books, researchers draw an analogy with today. Today, we protect our mobile devices with a PIN code. More sophisticated technologies make it possible to identify the owner by the retina of the eyes. The time is not far off when the right to own an item will be confirmed in a truly unique way, over and DNA. But the most incredible thing is that this, the most perfect method, has already been used on our planet. An interesting thing is connected with this weapon. The fact is that the weapon, only the chosen ones could enter with these weapons. Basically, they were some, again, descendants and some magi, or heroes, or some representatives of the reigning clans, and so on. In other words, it was actually a weapon that could serve and was launched, apparently, only with some kind of connection with DNA. That is, weapons can identify DNA directly, their native DNA. DNA is similar to the DNA of their creators, and, in fact, also work.
Родную им ДНК похожая на ДНК их создателей, и, собственно, также работает.
As a result, the researchers are convinced that mystical objects could not be passed on to outsiders. For example, a magic weapon could pass strictly by inheritance and after the father. A son with the original genetics could own it. And the secret of the disappearance of the crown of the Egyptian ruler may lie in the fact that over time, the genetic code of the dynasty has blurred to such an extent that the technological device simply ceased to identify its own owner. These technologies also exist at the moment, when a certain weapon also works precisely by interacting with the prints of its owner directly. If it turns out to be in someone else's hands and tries to be used, then the weapon simply becomes unusable. These technologies exist now, and quite possibly, in some way they were then. And we can say that this weapon is understandable. It was not only held in the hands and waved and hacked, it also had an amazing destructive power. This weapon is capable of recognizing DNA of his master, mentioned in chronicles of the many peoples of the world. So, the sword Kladinets, which is spoken about in many Russian epics and fairy tales, according to historians, belongs to the same category. Legends say that a Kladinets is a weapon that can kill any opponent. In some tales, he even becomes a weapon of mass destruction. A Kladinets is a secret bearer, because the Kladin, the word from which the Kladinets was formed with the help of pressing the suffix, is a secret, it is a cache. It is what is hidden. Therefore, a sword-bearing mystery. But what could be the mystery of a unique weapon called the Kladinets sword? Historians are sure, first of all, that it could not look like a sword, be used not like a sword, behave not like a sword. And this is another important detail. In the view of posterity, voiced in the ancient tales, the sword Kladinets has its own soul and consciousness. It was, of course, not so much about the sword as such.
Не столько о мече как таковом, да, сколько
In
о
other words,
неком,
the sword was a kind of
лишь о неком
symbol
символе,
because
да,
it is
потому что
clear
понятно,
that
что
not all weapons our
не всё
ancestors
оружие
could correctly describe.
наши предки
So
могли
any weapon could be described,
правильно описывать,
well,
поэтому они
roughly
любое
speaking,
оружие могли
a
описывать, ну,
sword,
грубо
a
говоря, меч,
spear,
копье,
a
лук.
bow.
Не факт, что это
It's
был
not a
именно,
fact that it was
именно
a
как
sword
таковой
as
меч.
such, but we
Но
can say that
можно
it
говорить о
was
том, что
capable
он
of destroying these immortal,
был способен
AHP
неким образом
immortal beings
уничтожать
in some
именно
way.
этих бессмертных и полубессмертных существ.
And they, in
Вот,
turn, were
они
considered immortal for a
оружие не
reason,
считались
which
бессмертными,
means
значит,
that,
соответственно, всё-таки
accordingly,
пытались убить
they were still tried to kill them
оружием,
with an
и это вряд
ironic
ли
weapon,
получалось.
and it hardly worked. While conducting research on ancient texts, historians noticed a strange pattern. Many epics contain a detailed description of handguns with all the signs of high technology. But it is in the Indian epic that an additional condition for the possession of such weapons appears. A person who has received the right to an incredible arsenal must have incredible parapsychological and spiritual capabilities. But this weapon, it is very important to note this, it is never described as a mechanism. Mechanism, that would be yantra in Sanskrit. And this weapon is first of all a mantra. The mantra, that is, God communicates a mantra, spells, a magic formula, which the hero when he uses. Then magically this mantra has an effect on his opponent.
Магически эта мантра оказывает воздействие на поиск противника.
How is this impact described? This impact can be, there say, the whole army burns into flames, or the army is sinking into sleep, or the army is seized with panic terror, and they are all there, including all the animals, run away in horror in different directions, and so on. One of the most powerful tactical means in the arsenal of ancient Indian heroes is called Brahmashiras. In terms of its functionality, described in the text, it is very similar to a tactical nuclear missile with a limited range and very high hit accuracy. The peculiarity of its use was that to launch such a rocket, a special mantra was needed, a set of certain words spoken in a certain state of consciousness. And the Brahmastra is such a type of weapon. It is also called the Brahma Shirasa in another way. In other words, this is a very powerful, very subtle weapon of such a higher order, that is, from the higher planets, let's say. And it is not activated with the help of a nuclear suitcase. With the help of some devices, it is activated by mantras. But how to enter the altered state in which the mantras began to work? Legends say that tens of years of spiritual practices were needed for this. However, recent discoveries prove that this may be an artistic exaggeration of the authors of the epic. Having studied the ancient chronicles more thoroughly, the researchers put forward a revolutionary theory, according to which the ancient weapon had a voice interface and a set of special speech commands, launched truly monstrous processes into action. It is very similar to nuclear weapons, only it is more powerful, has the ability, it has a directional effect. It can be controlled. That is, this particular weapon, it was launched and directed against the surviving 5 Pandavas and their sister. More precisely, the child who was in the womb. That is, they tried to destroy the remaining men of this kind in this way. That is, nuclear weapons, they usually act very roughly, that is, they destroy everything. Right. And this weapon, it has a directional effect. It can be started, it can be brought back, that is, its action could have been stopped. According to researchers, the Brahmastra could represent a whole disguised military complex. And that's why it might seem that completely real missiles are caused by simple spells. Indian epics describe not only melee weapons, but also bows that had incredible properties. However, on closer inspection, magic turns out to be a high science again. Arrows splitting according to the number of targets are very similar to missiles with separable warheads. And arrows flying exactly to the sound resemble warheads with autonomous guidance systems. The novel describes, it is said that King Dasharatha had the ability to direct his arrows by sound.
Обладал способностью направлять свои стрелы по звуку.
In other words, it was not just enough for him to hear some kind of acoustic vibration. Someone coughed, for example, he could have shot a blind arrow to hit exactly there. But it was enough for him, in principle, any movement of thought to send a weapon there. That is, to hit the target with an arrow or in some other way. But how? Trying to explain the incredible capabilities of the weapon ancient, researchers have proposed the revolutionary theory. Antimatter was used for its production. Otherwise, how to explain the truly supernatural qualities of the arsenal of the ancients? This seems incredible because today's scientists are only approaching the use of antimatter energy. And if this technology is discovered, there will be a revolution in the energy sector. From a reactor the size of an ordinary finger battery, it will be possible to saturate a huge metropolis with electricity. And with such energy resources, the issues of increasing the volume of the attacking part of the weapon become insignificant. Theoretically, they could refuel with anything. For example, in the Vagatapuran, an example is described when just a blade of grass was used as a weapon. Balaram plucked a blade of grass and just threw it. That is, the energy contained in this blade of grass was enough to produce the effect that it produced. That is, if a person knows how to control these energies, then he can use a blade of grass as a weapon more powerful than modern weapons, such as missiles with nuclear warheads and so on. You see, that is, you need to have the appropriate abilities for this. But were these technologies finally and irrevocably lost after the collapse of ancient civilizations? There is no unambiguous answer to this question, especially considering that in our recent history there are a huge number of riddles that can be interpreted in favor of an incredible version. Superweapons still exist, but they are used in the most exceptional cases and regardless of the desire of those in power. If we go back even to the same Moscow fire of 1812, there is also a very interesting point there, which is that if you read the chronicles and descriptions related to the Moscow fire, the fire looks quite strange. How do the officers describe him? At night, the sky lit up with a bright light, as if a second sun had flashed, and it was as bright as day. Then there was a roar, after which the heat went, and the walls of the stone structures began to melt. Napoleon miraculously escaped from this fire by escaping through secret passages from the Kremlin. Not a single powder magazine, not a single arsenal of those that were in Moscow could give such an explosive effect. But the strangest thing about the Moscow fire was not even that. Archaeologists and historians involved in the study of this event were surprised to note that the houses in the city were first destroyed, and only then burned down. That is, the fire was preceded by a shock wave. But even more strange were its consequences. What is interesting is that most of the people died. There is no fire. They died from a strange disease. People's skin began to peel off. They vomited. That is, people had all the signs of radioactive contamination. Therefore, again, it is quite possible to say that the actual fire of 1812 was again not quite a fire, but the use of one of such weapons preserved from ancient times, which, in fact, will actually destroy Napoleon's army.
вооружений, которые, собственно, позволили фактически уничтожить армию Наполеона.
Perhaps today, humanity is approaching the peak of its development, for at least the second time in its history. But there is a possibility that the superweapon that historians and archaeologists are talking about today has existed, and even been used all this time, which means that there are its keepers somewhere, but nothing is known about them, although rumors about powerful secret societies with mystical knowledge and incredible technologies have been circulating for the second 1,000 years. Knowledge about life and death, that is, it is an opportunity to live forever, and various ways of killing unwanted characters or even peoples, and accordingly, knowledge about health. Knowledge about health is, first of all, a thorough knowledge of the capabilities of the human body and the ability to manipulate them. Another type of weapon, rumors about which may well have confirmation, is a live weapon. Specially bred creatures designed for combat and war. In the year 2009, the world was shaken by a scientific sensation. A transgenic primate, designed by scientists in the laboratory, gave the first offspring. Genetic engineering has made a huge step forward. Dozens of international norms prohibiting such experiments prevented us from taking the next step and moving on to human improvement. The military departments, primarily interested in the prospects of improving the combat qualities of their own soldiers, returned to the usual areas of work, the invention of chemical cocktails. They repeatedly enhance the abilities of fighters for several days, but then give a severe withdrawal, which can end in death. All other efforts of military science are focused on improving the technologies of attack and defense. But as practice shows, experiments on humans have already been conducted on Earth. And those who were not bound by international laws or moral norms boldly experimented with the human breed, in search of a universal fighter. Researchers of this phenomenon are convinced that it was possible to encounter the results of such experiments quite recently. There is an amazing character in Christianity, the so-called Saint Christopher. He is depicted as a man with a dog's head. And given the fact that Christianity is a relatively young religion, it is by and large, we are talking about the fact that he, in fact, is a reference to the cynocephaly, referred to in Greek sources, and so on. That is, people with dog heads. These cynocephalians were described even by medieval travelers who traveled to the countries of Asia and the East, the countries of Africa. Therefore, many of these representatives remained literally until recently. Most of the modified creatures have come down to us exclusively in the form of mythical creatures, heroes of fairy tales and legends. However, many researchers are convinced that trolls impenetrable with conventional weapons, light invisible elves, wolves, werewolves, ghosts, vampires, and jinn. All these creatures were attempts to create prehistoric special forces designed to perform specific combat or reconnaissance tasks. We invite the same immigrants all over the world who do menial jobs. We invent robots and various equipment in order to relieve ourselves of certain production difficulties that we have and rough work. It is quite possible that the same thing was done by distant inhabitants of our planet who lived a long time ago. It was quite logical. In the same way, a high level of technology could allow them not only to produce certain robots, but also to move towards genetic engineering and produce living beings that could perform certain functions at an elementary level. It sounds incredible, but if we assume that the technological level allowed ancient people to produce homing nuclear missiles, and move freely between continents. Genetic engineering is one of the elements of a complex, highly developed civilization. These unique ancient drawings were discovered a few years ago in one of the caves of Australia. Scientists claim that this unusual image of people with the heads of animals is about 32,000 years old. And this may be proof that in the distant past, all kinds of human-animal hybrids already existed on our planet. Myths in other nations describe, say, Rakshasas. Well, these are half demons, half humans. They have the body of a man, huge teeth, like a saber-toothed tiger. Here they are, too. These Rakshasas are depicted there. Moreover, they clearly have some kind of civilizational level because they have weapons and everything else in their hands. All the attributes of a person. Snakes of some kind, dragons. But if centaurs, Ichthyosaurs, and other super beings once lived on Earth, what happened to them? According to one version, this civilization, like the human one, once inhabited the planet for a long time, but, having achieved incredible scientific and technological progress, it destroyed itself. I think in some cases, when we think about the origin of mythical creatures, it can be any of the categories. Yes, it can be symbolic. Yes, it can be incremental or high-tech. But I also think that in some cases it's something physiological. It's something like a mermaid or something like a minotaur. The minotaur is one of the scariest, most mysterious, but at the same time, one of the most detailed stories, about an artificially created mutant warrior. Ancient Greek legend describes him as a man with a bull's head. But if you read into a more detailed description, it becomes clear that this is not just a transplant of an animal's head to a person. The Minotaur had incredible physical strength, was taller and heavier than any guest of the labyrinth. In the case of the Minotaur, we really encounter such a creature, and we have to judge by the context as well. If someone says that the story about the Minotaur is completely fiction, it's just such information that is given great importance. Great. However, if we come to a place where we say, okay, this is a maze. This is the sign of the labyrinth where the Minotaur was supposed to be. Each of us will see that we have to take into account the possibility that the Minotaur is a physically real being. And if that's the case, should we try to establish what it was? Hybrid or what? The technological ability to cross a human and an animal appeared in the middle of the last century. It was then that scientists of Nazi Germany engaged in similar experiments as part of the program of racial hygiene and artificial breeding of Superman. After the history of the Third Reich ended with the complete defeat of Nazism, any experiments in the field of eugenics were banned. But even what Dr. Mengel's colleagues and associates managed to do was enough to understand the obvious thing: human-animal hybrids are possible in principle. Some of these experiments were done very simply. You don't have to be Einstein to conduct an experiment by connecting two beings together and seeing what happens. And we can match this with that of the Minotaur. This is an experiment by someone with very low moral qualities, but with great determination, and a desire to see where this barrier between species is. And the Minotaur could actually be a very reasonable answer, which tells us that there is no barrier between certain species. Every species on this earth can somehow interbreed with another. And again, the Minotaur may be something that reminds us that this is possible. This, at first glance, is an artificially grown animal, the product of those created by nature itself. Few people know that before getting one successful new kind of animal, several unsuccessful attempts are born, various hybrids of goats and pigs, birds and cows. Before Dolly the sheep was born, geneticists conducted more than 300 attempts. The planned Dolly was born only outwardly young. Her internal biological clock has not started from scratch since birth. But the worst thing is that artificially created creatures are gradually becoming stronger and will very soon displace those who created them. And it is possible that what we now call the greatest scientific breakthrough will become the greatest crime against humanity in the future. I met by chance at a forum in the Lipetsk Ecological with a figure who gives me a business card. They say, "Here is Herman Lvovich. My name is so-and-so. It is written there molecular. Institute of Molecular Genetics." I say, "Bro, isn't it you, Costa, modifying?" "Yes, we are. So you should be killed. If I had met you in the settlement, I would have filled you up right away and fed you to the pigs. The goats have remained one of a few real cattle. Nothing is happening to them yet." He says, "What, Herman Lvovich?" He was so taken aback and says everything in justification. People are already being modified. What kind of goats are there? Despite the fact that official experiments on human cloning are prohibited, information is increasingly emerging that American and Chinese scientists in classified laboratories continue to work on creating an artificial humanoid being. These mutants are created like constructors. By order, as in a store, you can choose the qualities that a new creature will possess. So, parents will even be able to create children for themselves, optionally introducing them, for example, the genes of a swimmer or a musician. A human embryo is added if a jumper, a kangaroo jenka is needed if a swimmer. The fish gene is introduced into the womb of harlots, and 15-year-old children are already running. They have a reproductive function. That is, it is also only a matter of time before there are a huge number of mutants. Because when crossing a mutant and a normal person, only a mutant turns out. Normal will not work anymore. And what was shown to us in the scary, fantastic, demonic films there is now reality. Scientists have already tried to predict the future picture of the world, and it turned out to be shocking. A reasonable person in his current form is doomed. If such a program is really implemented, then in the very near future, a new race of creatures with animal genes will appear on Earth. Like fish, they will be able to breathe underwater, like cheetahs, develop incredible speed, and, perhaps, even be able to fly like birds. But there will be nothing human about these creatures. So they will still breed with normal people, and new mutants will appear. Are you sure? These mutants will hate normal people because they will have an inferiority complex naturally. And humanity will be divided into mutants and normal people. And there will be more mutants and fewer of us. Ancient Greek myths have brought to us the echo of another genetic experiment. The dream of the ideal cavalry was realized in the form of centaurs, a horse with a human torso. The researchers note that the myth of their origin echoes the theme of a global conflict, the war of the gods and titans, which in fact could have been a war between two powerful civilizations that subsequently disappeared from the face of the earth. Take the centaurs. After all, the legend, the ancient Greek, the myth sounds, where did they come from? A cloud gave birth to them. Because once a certain titan coveted Aphrodite, but, having been refused, he was so excited that he threw up a seed that went into a cloud. She was even offended, Aphrodite, by these circumstances, and cursed this cloud. The cloud turned out to be centaurs, that is, half human, half ass. That was the goddess Anger. In fact, how is it? A man is half a man, half a horse. This, of course, is some kind of hybrid, probably not quite successful. I'm not even talking about some kind of Gorgon jellyfish, about some kind of monsters there, like snakes of some kind, and so on. All of these could also have been unsuccessful experiments. Indian sources also tell about the use of artificially created warriors. These are powerful Rakshasas. According to the texts, these wars were so terrifying that in the view of descendants, psychically modified combat units with paranormal capabilities turned into demons. Maharaj's friend fought with demons, with some rakshasas, yakshas. These are different types of demons. And these demons, they just used such a psychological, I do not know what to call it, psychotropic weapon. That is, not even mental, not psychotropic. That is, a weapon that is based precisely on sound vibrations, very subtle vibrations, and these vibrations caused hallucinations. Science can already describe the mechanics of this effect quite clearly. Ultrasound excites the nervous system and at certain frequencies can trigger the release of adrenaline, which is both a hormone of rage and a hormone of horror and panic. Infrasound is able to instantly enter into a state of such deep depression that the object begins to hallucinate, and the person becomes capable of spontaneous suicide. However, mythological creatures were not only the executors of someone else's will. Possible lords of darkness, dragons, Koshai, and other monsters, in many legends, become the head of the state and the army. Historians engaged in the study of this topic are sure that we are talking about specially bred creatures. And there is confirmation of this in a huge number of ancient sources. If you take ancient literary monuments written in different parts of the globe, such as the Zola legends and legends, or get acquainted with the information left by adherents of the Gnostic doctrine, for example, the Cathars or some other Gnostic and Christian sects whose homeland is, for example, Egypt, or check out the information left by the Sumerian civilization that existed on the territory of modern Iraq. Countries such as Sumer, Babylon, where a lot of clay tablets with cuneiform script were found, which were subsequently translated by scientists. All of these sources say that in this part of the world there was a kind of non-human race that mixed with representatives of the human race, and as a result, there were hybrid ancestral lines consisting of beings who were half aliens and half people. In the 2010 year, American scientists conducted a unique gene analysis of an unusual mummy found in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. Up to this point, they found it difficult to say whose remains were discovered by archaeologists. After all, in its structure, the body did not resemble a human in any way, but rather resembled the torso of an alien creature. An elongated face, an abnormally sized skull that is 1.5 times larger than that of ordinary people, and long limbs. It all looked faintly like a human body. The remains belonged to the ruler of Egypt, Akhenaten. But why did the pharaoh have such an unusual body? In search of answers, scientists turned to ancient Egyptian papyri and found amazing facts there. In one of the manuscripts, there is a description of how thousands of years ago, the ancient gods descended from heaven to earth. And when that happened, appeared on earth far more infants than in normal years. If a spacecraft descends to people, let's say the ancient Egyptians, and aliens come out, then, of course, they will take them for gods. This is unequivocal. They will pray, they will kneel, they will describe as some kind of chariot, because otherwise they would not perceive the movement as the chariot, and the horses landed on them, and so on. It is quite possible that once aliens landed on us, we deified them. Well, of course, myths. Here, myths are born, myths die. In an ancient manuscript, it is said that even queens who for a long time could not conceive an heir, boys were unexpectedly born. The Egyptians explained this by the fact that, descending to earth, the gods entered into contact with earthly women and gave future heirs to royal families. All these discoveries allowed scientists to put forward a version according to which Pharaoh Akhenaten was born by an earthly woman, but conceived by God. This can explain the strange features of his body. The researchers found another confirmation of this version by studying the only lifetime drawing of the royal family, which is kept today in the Berlin Museum. It shows Akhenaten and his wife sitting opposite each other and holding their children in their arms. The genuine interest of scientists was aroused by the appearance of the children of the royal line. In the portrait, they are depicted with abnormally elongated heads. Were their children, like their father, demigods? Moreover, the Egyptians themselves believed that all pharaohs were of extraterrestrial origin. They were convinced that they were sent to earth by the gods in order to command the Egyptian peoples. There is material that the gods either settled or flew to their planet, or connected in one way or another. First of all, paradoxically, Sirius. Although it is a star, there are two planets there. But this is said both in ancient Egypt and among the Dogons, the people inhabiting the territory of Mali. Scientists involved in the study of this phenomenon have noted an interesting feature. Legends describing a genetic experiment to introduce a special race designed to rule nations are not limited only to ancient Egypt. Moreover, the earliest mentions of rulers who came from heaven are preserved in ancient Chinese manuscripts. The emperors of ancient China justified their right to ascend the throne by the fact that they were descended from serpentine gods. And, of course, do not forget about the dragon symbolism, which is widespread in the Far East, and which is also very closely related to what we are talking about now. The brightest star of the constellation of Scorpio Antares, the Chinese have long been called the heart of the great dragon god. They have always believed that it was the dragon god who gave rise to the Chinese people. According to ancient Chinese mythology, which arose 3,000 years before our era, the god and future emperor of China named Huangdi descended to earth from the sky in a white egg and came out of the belly of a fire-breathing dragon. If we look at China again, there are very interesting mentions of aliens from outer space. This is clearly described in its purest form. This is the so-called Yellow Emperor. That is, the Chinese consider it their own Prometheus, a teacher who gave the Chinese craft. And it is believed that he brought just the knowledge of acupuncture, and knowledge related to these Eastern energy techniques, and knowledge related to the Book of Changes and Zen. But who really was the dragon from whose belly Yellow Emperor Huangdi came out? A creature of flesh and blood, or an apparatus specially designed to travel over vast cosmic distances. Researchers claim that the ancient Chinese took it for a dragon. In fact, it was a special equipment designed to isolate a living organism from the external environment, a kind of spacesuit that astronauts put on before going into outer space. Probably, there was some kind of shell, which turned out to be unnecessary on Earth. So maybe they were just spacesuits, and they learned to live without them. And the color of the skin indicates what kind of light spectrum was on this or that planet. The theme of serpentine gods, who created a hybrid of their species and man, has found an unexpected continuation in the religious cults of Central America, and among civilizations that can compete at their age with both China and India. Take, for example, the Indian peoples who lived in Central America, such as the Maya and the Aztecs. They worshipped serpentine gods, such as Kukulkan in Mayan mythology, as well as Quetzalcoatl, one of the main gods of the civilizations that inhabited Central America. In Sumerian mythology, these creatures are called Anunnaki, aliens from heaven on earth. The Gnostics call them Arcana, the Zulus Shitori, children of the serpent.
дети змеи.
This is also reflected in Islamic mythology, the part of it that is associated with the concept of jinn. If the eugenic experiments of aliens with the appearance of a snake can be proved only at the level of myths, then another religious version about the mixing of different biological species has the most concrete, material confirmation. Moses, when he leaves Egypt on his way to Israel, he meets tribes and learns that they are the descendants of Natalina, Marina, who are in sexual relations with earthly women. So we know that relatively recently, 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, there were offspring that were gigantic. And perhaps the skeletons that are found belong to these giants. In a number of cases, we found people with an abnormal skull. We found abnormal skeletons in certain places. We're trying to explain it. The probability that modern humanity will one day follow the same path and come to the creation of genetically modified creatures is extremely low today. It is obvious that the hereditary memory of the Earth's population has vivid memories of the terrible consequences that uncontrolled and unrestricted interference with human nature can lead to. Researchers of prehistoric civilizations agree that it was the absence of moral principles and humanism, which limited the self-destructive aggression of man, that led the most ancient mankind to complete collapse and its own destruction. In the early 2013 year, the American company specializing in the orders of the Ministry of Defense have demonstrated a fundamentally new device, tactical jumpsuit for intelligence operations. The fabric, made of a special material and stuffed with electronics, made its wearer completely invisible in the active state. The dream of spies and assassins about the invisibility cap has come true. But, as the research of historians shows, this means of warfare is not a unique invention. The art of being invisible, as well as becoming more than more or less than less, is a natural art that yogis have achieved in the process of long training. But the same art was given to those to whom who was ready. But it could be given as a gift again by these celestials. In other words, it was not at all necessary to perform any serious austerities. But it was simply enough to receive the blessing of either a sage or someone else to manage subtle energies. Scientists who are engaged in the study of myths in a substantive way are sure that in this case, we are talking again about technology that gives the impression of magic. By the sage's blessing, the sources mean the transfer of control of the masking technique because the art of invisibility, described as a kind of magical practice, is actually a high technology that uses the features of human vision. Human vision is limited to a very small, almost infinitesimal frequency range, which is scientifically called visible radiation. Everything that is at other frequencies that are not in the frequency range of visible radiation, or as you know, is at other levels, outside the electromagnetic field, we cannot see. Incredibly, the work of the latest tactical camouflage, presented last year by American developers, is based on this principle. It is also based on the mystical technology of yogis, which allows a person to become invisible. And for the same reason, according to researchers, people so rarely see UFOs that prefer to stay at frequencies inaccessible to the human eye. Thus, for example, when people say that they managed to accidentally see a UFO, they honestly admit how everything really was. They say that the UFO suddenly appeared from nowhere, and then in the same way, inexplicably disappeared. Thus, someone can say, I saw this creature. This creature is of extraterrestrial origin. It appeared from nowhere and then suddenly disappeared. Ordinary people ask in such cases, how much did you drink before it happened? In fact, the following happened. A person saw an aircraft or a reptilian creature that can usually be seen outside the visible zone of the radiation spectrum. This feature of human vision is used in another legend describing another phenomenon. The ability to instantly appear in different places and immediately disappear. In the Indian epic about Rama and the city, it looks like a method of fighting from the astral. Moreover, it also says that at that time, there was a possibility of countering this unique disguise. In those days, the energies were controlled with the help of the mind, with the help of willpower, right? Ravana, the demon with whom the hero Prince Rama fought, used weapons, poems, weapons of water, weapons of heat, weapons of cold. And he also used the disappearing weapon, so to speak, yes. That is, he disappeared and appeared when it was unprofitable for the enemy. He disappeared. Then, for example, he appeared behind the enemy's back in order to deliver a decisive blow. But since the forces were unequal, it means that Prince Rama, as described in the novel, had much more powerful weapons. He suppressed the actions of the demon Ravana's heavenly weapon with his super-heavenly weapon. According to legend, Rama's super-celestial weapon could be a special device capable of expanding the visible spectrum. And in this case, the demon using the mystical camouflage had no chance. In other words, it can be seen at other frequencies that are not included in the frequency range of visible radiation. Therefore, in this case, it seems to the observer that this creature originated from nowhere. It became visible to the observer for a very short period of time, and then disappeared in the same way, in an incomprehensible way. Thus, these creatures, which are described in great detail in Islamic mythology as jinn, and which are called differently in other cults, they are overwhelmingly invisible to the human eye. However, countering such armor can become quite dangerous. The developers of the invisibility suit, answering the question about possible ways to counteract this method of disguise, gave a good example. Radio conversations can be conducted on a specific wave, and in order to intercept them, it is necessary to go through all the frequencies of the ether, which can take a very long time. And if you try to listen to all frequencies at once, there will be information noise in which the voices on the right wave will simply be indistinguishable. An attempt to scan the entire spectrum of the invisible will lead to the same result, with the difference that, unlike radio frequencies, the search spectrum is infinite. Our human perception and all organs, they are sharpened, tuned to certain waves. The fact is that, for example, there are a lot of sounds in the same space. And if we just heard all these sounds, we would simply go deaf from this roar. But again, our hearing, it filters these sounds and adapts. The same vision. There are a lot of spectra of lights, those that we know about, those that we don't know about. There is a kind of black light, which, according to one of the theories, study black holes that we don't see. And again, it is absolutely possible that these creatures are simply outside of these spectra. Myths about perfect armor are not limited to an invisibility cap and a mysterious Indian weapon that can hide its owner from view. Egyptian legends tell of the mysterious armor of Pharaoh Ramses II, which was a means of defense and attack at the same time. Ramses II donned a magical armor, then sat on his chariot and headed into the thick of the battle. He was surrounded by 2,500 chariots of the Hittites, after which something amazing happened. A kind of force field formed around Ramses' chariot, and all the Katas fell to the ground and could do nothing. He just walked around, chopped them down, destroyed them, and thereby created a glorious victory. A lot of people then naturally tried to find the weapons, the armor that Ramses II had, but unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, they never found it. Humanity was engaged in improving the tools of murder and destruction. Historians suggest that this urge for destruction once led to the disappearance of ancient civilizations. Traces of incredible technologies can be clearly traced in myths and legends around the world, and in different parts of the world. Their actual confirmations are periodically found. Previously, it was considered a myth. Now historical science takes this more seriously. Because if you take the factual material, especially the factual material collected around the world regarding ancient cultures and civilizations, you will see that the same phenomena are described everywhere, only they are called differently. It's very interesting. Great civilizations have left us a very stingy legacy. Obviously, such a small number of traces can only indicate two things: that they were destroyed a very long time ago, and the scale and intensity of destruction cannot be described. But even what remains testifies to scientific and intellectual power, incomparable with modern humanity. When we talk about structures like Stonehenge and the Great Pyramid, science says that it is simply impossible to explain it. We understand that we know this. Objectively, they had more technology because our ancestors were more knowledgeable and had more knowledge than we assumed. In addition to huge structures, which neither weapons nor time could destroy, the most ancient civilizations have left us a number of smaller traces. Having studied them, an attentive observer, armed with modern knowledge, flair and erudition, can draw conclusions about how far our ancestors have overtaken us today. I've written a whole book about it, about artifacts that don't fit into the pictures of our history, but they were found, and they contradict what we were taught at school. Let me give a couple examples. In my private collection, there is an ancient Indian ritual dagger, aka killa. His age is 1,000 or 1,100 years. It is made of doped material, which, strictly speaking, should not exist on our planet. An examination conducted at the University of Wismar showed that the oxygen content in this doping reaches almost 15%, although even with the help of the most modern technologies, this is impossible. In addition, aluminum was found in the dagger, which humanity learned to produce about 130 years ago. How in India of the 10th century could there be a technology that humanity is not capable of at 20 with a pen? I can give you a better example. From Russia. In the early 90s, in the Urals, on the small Narada River, gold prospectors accidentally stumbled upon tens of thousands of tiny spiral-shaped artifacts. The largest of them are only 3 centimeters, the smallest are 3/100ths of a millimeter. They are better viewed under a microscope. It was determined that these artifacts consist of rare metals such as tungsten and molybdenum. But the biggest surprise, and this was confirmed by an examination in one of the Moscow institutes, was the age of these objects. About 300,000 years. Question: who could have made these amazing things at a time when our distant ancestors were running around the earth, all covered with wool? Neither skeptics from science nor supporters of conservative theories will be able to give answers to these questions, because they are not even ready to admit the fact that everything they have been taught has no basis, and that humanity is now entering at least the second round of history, risking ending it as sadly as its predecessors. And monuments, artifacts, and myths are a cry from the past, which warn us that a person should be extremely careful when going about his own craving for destruction. Because the previous civilization could not cope with it, despite the fact that it was much more ahead of us in spiritual development. than in technological development. A person should hear the voice of the past, the voice of the weapon of the ancients, which, in accordance with its sacred purpose, transmits mythological information to all those who can receive it. Weapons have, among other things, properties, special properties, to transmit particularly mythological information, to convey a person's understanding of the laws of the surrounding world. Special mythical stories to spread, add up, and transmit. Will we be able to hear the information that we transmit the ancient weapon will be revealed in the near future. Because today we are as close as possible to the level of military development of our distant ancestors, which means that the account goes on 4 years, perhaps 4 decades. And if humanity remains deaf to the terrible warning from the past, then our distant descendants in millions of years will decipher the signals left by our weapons, which will become the weapons of the ancients for them.